Why was everyone watching her in silence, yet pretending they were? The dust of forward operating base Kestrel hung in the air like memory itself, fine, ochre, and relentless. It clung to skin, rifles, and regret with the same precision. Out here, everything was coated in the same layer of exhaustion and sand-colored resignation. From the back of a dust-caked Oshkosh truck, she stepped down one boot at a time. Sergeant Major Ella Vance. No fanfare, no escort. Just the grind of her boots on gravel and the flat glare of a merciless sun. Her duffel bag hung over one shoulder, the strap biting against a frame that stood straight despite years of weight, visible and invisible both. The Marines nearby didn't salute. They didn't have to. This wasn't a parade ground. This was the end of the world in camouflage. Leaning against a wall of sandbags, a Force Recon Fire team cleaned their rifles, or pretended to. Mostly they were watching her. The leader, Staff Sergeant Rivas, smirked under the shade of his boonie hat, a predator's smile. "Get a load of the new command sergeant major," he muttered. His voice was low but meant to carry. "She looks like she went 3 rounds with a badger and lost." A few muffled laughs followed. Corporal Miller snorted, his eyes never leaving her face. Her scars were impossible to miss. A silver one carved a crooked path from her temple to her cheek, pulling one corner of her eye slightly down. Another traced across her upper lip, and her hands, burn-pocked, knotted with pale ridges of healed skin, looked like they'd held both fire and sorrow. Vance didn't react. The words hit her ears the way rain hits armor, noted but irrelevant. She'd heard worse. In barracks, in bars, in the quiet half-mockery of men who feared what they didn't understand. Men who saw scars as flaws, not history. She kept walking. The air shimmered with heat and silence. Inside the perimeter, the wind carried the same old song, generator hum shouted orders, the distant pop of live fire training. But beneath it, she heard the quieter things: unease, fatigue, pride. The living pulse of a forward base that existed too close to chaos. She ducked into the command tent, where the smell of stale coffee and sweat fused with electronics. A massive digital map glowed across one wall. General Marcus Thorne stood before it, tall, precise, the kind of man who wore rank like a well-cut uniform. He didn't turn as she entered. "Sergeant Major," he said simply. "Sir." He faced her now, eyes scanning her face, taking in the scars, then moving on, professional, unbothered. "Welcome to Kestrel," he said. "Things are kinetic here." "They usually are, sir." "Your reputation precedes you. Administrative brilliance, they tell me. We need that. This task force is a logistical nightmare." "Administrative." The word landed soft, but carried a weight she'd grown used to. That was what the record said. That was the safe version of her career, the one stamped and filed. Vance nodded once. "Understood, sir." Thorne gestured toward the map. "Briefing at 1800. You'll want to be there, know what our Marines are walking into." "Yes, sir." When she left, the tent flap swung shut behind her, and the general's young aide finally exhaled. "Sir, with respect," the captain said, "Force Recon won't take kindly to oversight from personnel." Thorne grunted. "They don't have to like her, they just have to respect her rank." He turned back to the map. "And maybe Rivas will learn not every problem needs a door kick and a flashbang." Outside, the whispers followed her. Every new posting came with them. Stories, rumors, sideways glances. But this base, this place felt different. It was too raw, too exposed. It felt like a wound that hadn't healed. Evening came fast in the valley, the kind of dusk that turned everything the color of gunmetal. The briefing room was nothing more than plywood, sweat, and electricity humming in the walls. General Thorne stood at the front, the digital projector casting his shadow large against the map. "Our target," he said, is Tar al-Hayman, insurgent commander, bomb maker, orchestrator of the last 3 ambushes in this region. Intel places him here. A red circle blinked on the screen. Rivas leaned forward, elbows on the table. Sir, my team can be in and out in 20 minutes. South approach Valley Road. We hit fast before they blink. His confidence was thick enough to taste. The men around him nodded, charged by it. From the back of the room, her voice came quiet but certain. Sir, Vance said, what's the intel on the northern ridge? Every head turned. Rivas' smirk returned. It's a goat trail, Sergeant Major, he said. Impassable, 6-hour climb minimum. We'd lose surprise completely. The satellite imagery shows disturbed soil along the valley, Vance replied evenly. IED patterning. They want you to take that road. The silence stretched, uneasy testing. Miller laughed softly. Guess that's why she handles paperwork, huh? The others joined in. That low, locker room kind of laughter that covers insecurity. Vance ignored it. Her eyes stayed on the map, calm, focused. The northern ridge offers overwatch, she said, tracing with a small laser pointer. High ground here, here, and here. A small support team could suppress the compound while the main force uses the western ravine. Slower but safer. You'd come in from dead ground. Too slow, too careful, too complicated, that was the consensus unspoken on every Marine's face. Rivas leaned back. We go in fast, sir, we own the night. Thorne hesitated. Both plans made sense. One was doctrine, the other was experience. Finally he nodded. We stick with the southern route. And just like that, the discussion ended. No one saw the brief flicker in her eyes. Not anger, not pride, just quiet resignation. She had given her truth. It was dismissed. It had happened before. When the meeting broke, Rivas paused by her chair, flashing that same crooked grin. Don't worry, Sergeant Major, he said. We'll be back before your coffee gets cold. His laughter trailed out the door with the rest of his men. Only Sergeant Chun lingered a moment. He didn't say anything, just gave her a small, respectful nod. He'd seen her eyes, the way she looked at maps like memories, not abstractions. He didn't know why, but he trusted her. Vance watched them go. Her gaze drifted back to the red circle on the map, and the thin, vulnerable line of the valley road. Her jaw set. She'd seen too many young men walk into traps laid by arrogance. She prayed this time would be different. But she knew better. The first explosion came hours later. A sound too deep to be thunder, too final to be mistaken. In the Tactical Operations Center, the floor vibrated under the shockwave. Drone footage flickered, white flashes on a black and gray landscape. Contact, Voodoo 1 is hit, IED. Static, shouting. Then machine gun bursts cut through the feed. General Thorne cursed under his breath. Talk to me, Rivas, status. The voice that came back was tight, panicked. We're in it, sir. It's a kill box. Multiple contacts. Heavy fire from the East Ridge, mortars walking in. The feed blurred as explosions rippled across the valley. The Marines were pinned, their vehicles shredded. Vance stood at the back of the room, her face unreadable. No panic, no noise. Just eyes analyzing, measuring distances, calculating fields of fire. They're jammed, the comms tech stammered. Signal interference across all bands. Thorne slammed a fist on the table. Get me a QRF. Closest team is 20 minutes out. Too long. On the screen she saw it clearly, how they were trapped exactly where she'd warned. How the road had funneled them into perfect killing range. Every second stretched like glass about to break. No one noticed when she turned and walked out. The armory was nearly empty. Her hand went not to the racks of M4s, but to a locked case in the back, old, dust-covered. She keyed in a code from memory. The lid hissed open. Inside lay a weapon that didn't belong to any standard issue list. An M110 SAS, worn smooth by time and precision. Her own. Her reflection winked back from the scope, fractured by the scar that caught the fluorescent light. She slung it over her shoulder, grabbed a compact pack already prepped, and headed for the motor pool. The MPs on guard didn't even ask. Something in her stride told them not to. She bypassed the armored trucks and climbed into a light Polaris MRZR. The engine purred awake, low, alive. She turned not south, toward the firefight, but north, toward the ridge they had called impossible. The wind tore at her face, and the night bled around her like ink. Every bump, every jolt of the rough trail, carried her closer to something she'd tried to leave buried. The part of her that once had a call sign. A name whispered like a ghost, Spectre. She gunned the engine harder. Behind her, the base still crackled with comms and confusion. Ahead, the mountains waited, cold, jagged, unforgiving. And somewhere down there, in the kill zone she'd predicted, her Marines were dying. Her jaw clenched. Not on my watch. Not again. She drove into the darkness, a lone figure, swallowed by the mountain shadow. No backup, no orders, no fanfare. Just duty. And the whisper of something unspoken. Maybe ghosts don't fade. Maybe they return when they're needed most. How far would she go to fix a mistake that wasn't hers? The Polaris tore across the jagged ground, headlights off, engine snarling low in the cold night air. Each rise and fall of the terrain tested the vehicle's suspension and her will, but Sergeant Major Ella Vance didn't slow, not once. The ridgeline loomed ahead, a black spine against a bruised sky. It wasn't a road, it wasn't even a path, just a cruel incline of rock and scree, exactly as Rivas had described it. Impassable, he'd said. But then, he'd never met a wall she hadn't already learned how to climb. She killed the engine halfway up, the echo of the motor dying in the hollow silence of the mountains. From here, it would be on foot. She stepped out, slinging her rifle, shouldering her pack. The night wind bit at her face, pulling at the small wisps of hair that had escaped her bun. Every breath was thin, sharp, and alive. Each step upward reminded her of another mountain, another lifetime. The pain in her knees wasn't from age, it was from memory. Bosnia, Chechnya, a dozen nameless places she'd promised herself she'd forget, but memories don't fade when they're carved into your flesh. She climbed without hesitation, without rest. Her boots scraped stone, her gloves gripped cold rock, and her heartbeat found a rhythm, steady, methodical. Somewhere below, the firefight still raged. The faint pops of distant gunfire drifted up, swallowed by the thin air. She could almost feel the desperation in those sounds, Marines pinned, praying, bleeding. And she knew what they were feeling. That silent terror that creeps in when the radio goes dead, when the plan you trusted falls apart, when the sky above feels too empty to save you. By the time she reached the summit, the eastern horizon had begun to fade from black to slate blue. The air was freezing. She dropped to her knees behind a pair of jagged boulders and let her eyes adjust. Below her, the valley. A jagged scar of dust and death. The convoy was a burning skeleton. One truck flipped, the other half sunk into the ditch. Small bursts of gunfire flickered like dying stars along the southern edge of the road. The enemy was everywhere, dug in, methodical, coordinated. She could see it all now. The interlocking arcs of fire, the mortar position behind a ridge, the flashes of muzzle flare from 3 elevated nests. They were trapped. Rivas and his team were being erased. Vance lay prone, unrolled a small mat, and set the M110 down. Her hands worked with the patience of ritual, bipod extended, bolt checked, scope aligned. Every movement was clean, precise, silent. The way she breathed told the story of someone who had done this too many times to count. Her eyes through the scope turned the chaos below into a pattern, a deadly puzzle she could read. Wind direction, range, elevation, target priority. Numbers, distances, calculations, they were the language she spoke best. She took out a compact Kestrel wind meter, checked the readings, adjusted the scope dials by instinct. Then she just listened. The wind, the distant cries, the sound of men fighting for their lives, men who had mocked her hours ago. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, her heartbeat slowed. The world narrowed to the small circle of glass before her eye. One figure stood out among the chaos, shouting orders, moving between positions, the unmistakable body language of command. The enemy leader. She centered him in the reticle. Half a breath out. Hold. The rifle spoke once, a hard, clean crack that shattered the quiet. The man's head snapped back. He dropped instantly. Before the echo could fade, she'd already reloaded. Second target, the machine gunner chewing through the Marine's cover. Crack. Down. Then the mortar operator. Crack. Another. She moved like a ghost, her scope gliding across the battlefield, her body steady as stone. Every pull of the trigger was surgical, emotionless. The rifle's report rolled like distant thunder across the valley, untraceable, unseen. Below, confusion spread through the enemy ranks like panic through dry grass. The coordinated fire broke down. Without their leader, they began shouting over each other, blind and scrambling. Within 60 seconds, she had dismantled the structure of an entire ambush. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She shifted position slightly, angling her rifle toward the far ridge where a second wave was preparing to flank the Marines. Her left hand adjusted the elevation. Her right index finger rested like patience itself. Crack. The radio man fell first. Crack. Then the second. Crack. A gunner slumped over his weapon. Her breathing never changed. Her pulse was a whisper. Each shot was a thought. Each target a memory erased. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, silence fell. The drone feed, moments ago an image of chaos, now showed something else entirely. Enemy signatures dropping. One after another. Like ghosts being exorcised from the ground. Sir, the comms tech's voice shook. The enemy fire stopped. It's just stopped. Thorne leaned forward, eyes wide. What the hell happening down there? Then a voice. Calm, controlled, almost serene. Static cracked through the radio. Threat axis neutralized. All primary targets serviced. Voodoo 1, you are clear to break contact to the west. I have overwatch. Every head turned toward the speakers. The voice was unmistakably female. The call sign attached to it made Thorne freeze. Spectre is on station. For a long moment, no one moved. Thorne's aide typed frantically at the operations terminal, pulling up old clearance codes, buried databases. He found a file locked, redacted, ancient. The name Spectre glared in the header. It wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It belonged to a classified unit, disbanded, disavowed. Ghost operatives. Precision snipers sent into places the government would never admit to being. There were only a handful. And only one had ever been listed as active until 2003. Operative Vance Ella. The aide swallowed hard. Sir, he said quietly, Spectre isn't just a call sign, it's her. Thorne stared at the radio. His mind reeled. The quiet, scarred woman who'd walked into his office hours ago wasn't just logistics. She was legend. A ghost they'd buried in paperwork. He looked at the map again. The valley that had been a kill zone minutes ago was now a place of eerie calm. The Marine heat signatures were moving, alive. Get me that channel, he ordered. Static. Then, after a pause. Raven, Nest, Spectre standing by. Get your people out of there. Her tone never changed. Not pride, not fear, just duty, clean, quiet, absolute. Down in the valley, Rivas crouched behind shattered concrete, his rifle barrel smoking. His ears rang from the endless exchange of fire, and then suddenly it had stopped. The air was heavy, unnatural. He peeked over the ridge. The enemy gun nests that had shredded them were silent. Bodies slumped over their weapons. A few silhouettes ran for the hills. Something had turned the tide. "What the hell?" Miller whispered beside him, clutching his bleeding arm. "Where did they go?" Rivas didn't answer, he knew. Somewhere in the back of his mind, between disbelief and dread, the truth clicked into place. The ridge, the route she'd recommended. The overwatch position he'd mocked. He'd called it a waste of time. But that's where she was now. Up there alone. Saving the lives of men who had laughed at her scars. "Move," he barked, forcing his voice steady. "Grab Miller, we're exfiling west." The Marines rallied, battered, bleeding, but alive. They fired short bursts, covering each other as they withdrew, dragging their wounded through the dust. Every few seconds, a distant crack echoed through the mountains. Each time, another enemy fell. Each shot bought them another breath, another step toward safety. By the time they reached the rally point, a dry riverbed shielded by low cliffs, the silence had become unbearable. They were alive because of her. Every man there knew it. And not one of them could find the words to say it. She was waiting for them. Leaning casually against her MRZR, the same one she'd driven up the mountain, rifle resting against the frame. The barrel still faintly smoked. Her expression was calm, almost detached. As the team stumbled toward her, she walked forward, not saying a word. She knelt beside Corporal Miller, examined his wound. "Let me see that," she said softly. Her hands, those same scarred, burned hands they once mocked, moved with delicate precision, wrapping a tourniquet, applying pressure, doing what needed to be done. Miller couldn't look her in the eye. He swallowed hard. Shame burned deeper than the wound. Rivas stood a few feet away, watching in silence. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to thank her. But his throat locked up. The words weren't enough. They never would be. She didn't ask for thanks. Didn't offer comfort. Just handed Miller's arm back to him and nodded once. "You'll live," she said simply. When she finally looked up at Rivas, there was no judgment in her eyes, no satisfaction, just calm. She held his gaze for a long, heavy second. And in that silence, he understood everything he'd gotten wrong. Sergeant Chun stepped forward beside him and gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a soldier's gesture of respect that didn't need words. The others followed. No one spoke, no one dared. The thump of approaching Blackhawks grew louder, rescue inbound. As the wind from the rotors whipped the dust into a storm, Vance turned away, grabbing her rifle and pack. Her job was done. But for the first time in a long time, something flickered in her eyes. Not pride, something smaller, sadder, a reminder that ghosts don't belong in sunlight. The helicopters lifted them out of the valley, the wounded, the weary, the humbled. Below, the battlefield shrank into a blur of smoke and sand. None of them spoke. Not one dared to break the silence that belonged to her. Rivas stared out the open door at the mountains sliding beneath them. He thought he understood strength, loud, hard, physical. But now he knew better. Real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It just acts. Why did the flight back feel heavier than the fight itself? The rotors hammered the thin air, beating a rhythm that no one dared interrupt. The cabin was packed, wounded men, shaken faces, silence so thick it could smother thought. Every vibration of the helicopter pressed the truth deeper into them. They were alive because of her. And none of them had known who she was. Sergeant Major Ella Vance sat near the ramp, helmet off, eyes fixed on nothing. The wind from the open side door whipped strands of gray hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush them away. The M110 rifle rested upright between her knees, barrel angled toward the floor. It looked like a relic, a sacred object that had chosen its own priest. Rivas sat across from her, bandaged and hollow-eyed. Miller slept beside him, his arm bound tight in a blood-stained sling. Chun watched her in quiet study, the way her chest rose evenly, unhurried, as though she'd never just walked through fire. The crew chief gave a thumbs-up to the cockpit. 5 minutes to Kestrel, he shouted. No one answered. Outside, the horizon was bright with early morning, a cruel, beautiful contradiction. The same sun that had illuminated their near death now painted the mountains gold. Dust clouds swirled below as the forward operating base came into view, HESCO barriers, landing pads, a patchwork of tents and steel. Ordinary again, as if the world hadn't almost ended hours ago. Rivas glanced at Vance. She didn't return the look. Her eyes were somewhere far away, or perhaps deep inside, where memory hides the things too heavy to speak. He wanted to say her name. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. But when he opened his mouth, all he could manage was a rasping breath. The helicopter dipped, flared, and settled onto the landing pad. The sound was deafening, rotor wash, shouted commands, the scrape of boots against metal. The ramp dropped. For a long second, no one moved. Then the Marines began to file out, carrying the wounded, shielding their eyes from the blinding light. The smell of jet fuel and dust hit like a wave. And there, waiting on the tarmac, stood General Thorne and nearly every senior officer on the base. Word had traveled faster than the rotor blades. The moment Vance stepped off the ramp, the noise seemed to fade. Conversation stilled, motion slowed. Even the wind hesitated. Thorne walked forward alone, his boots slicing through the dust. His face was unreadable, not stern, not soft, simply focused. The other officers watched, uncertain. Vance stopped when they were face to face. Her rifle hung at her side, the same weapon that had saved half the men standing nearby. She looked up at him, not defiantly, not submissively, just steady. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them pulsed with everything unspoken, disbelief, awe, understanding. Then Thorne moved. He came to rigid attention. His right hand snapped upward in a crisp, perfect salute, the kind that belongs to ceremony, not chaos. And he held it. A general saluting first. To a sergeant major. To a ghost that had saved them all. Gasps rippled through the officers behind him. One by one, they followed his lead, captains, majors, colonels, their arms rising in unison. Then from the side, Rivas's voice cut through the wind, hoarse, unsteady. Platoon 10 Hut. Every Marine on that pad, battered and bandaged though they were, snapped to attention. Miller struggled to his feet, his wounded arm trembling but raised. Even Chun's jaw was tight as he lifted his hand in salute. And for the first time since the battle, Ella Vance hesitated. Her eyes moved across the rows of faces, men who had mocked her, doubted her, laughed at her scars. Now every one of them stood straight, eyes locked, hands high. The silence was reverent. Vance's throat tightened, only for a heartbeat. Then she did what soldiers do, what dignity demands. She raised her hand and returned the salute. No words. No speeches. Just that single gesture, precise, steady, final. The wind carried grit across the pad, stinging eyes that pretended it was only dust. Later, inside the operations tent, the base hummed with restrained chaos. Reports, after-action reviews, the usual scramble of military order rebuilding itself after the storm. But under it all ran a different current, hushed tones, incredulous whispers. Spectre's real. Wasn't that program shut down in the 90s? She was personnel. She was death from above. Each retelling grew a little larger, a little holier. Legends are born that way, one grain of truth wrapped in awe. Vance ignored it all. She walked the perimeter quietly, checked on the medics treating her wounded Marines, signed off supply requests. No special treatment, no speeches, just work. Inside the command tent, General Thorne sat behind his desk, a folder open before him, thick, classified, lined with black ink. The file they'd unearthed that morning, the one marked Spectre. He read through the lines again, or rather, through the blank spaces where the truth used to be. Every page was redacted, entire paragraphs struck out, entire missions erased. But the fragments that remained painted enough of a picture. Covert operations across war-torn continents, single-handed reconnaissance in hostile territory, confirmed targets neutralized in conditions deemed impossible. And finally, the injury report: grenade shrapnel, severe burns, loss of field capability. Recommendation: transfer to administrative duty. Asset considered non-deployable. Non-deployable. Thorne closed the file and rubbed his eyes. They had buried a legend under bureaucracy, and then laughed at the ghost they'd made. His aide cleared his throat softly. "Sir, Force Recon, asking if she'll be joining the debrief." Thorne shook his head. "She's done enough." Evening fell fast. The base lights flickered on, painting the valley in dull amber. Inside a dim maintenance bay, away from the noise, Vance sat alone at a workbench. Her rifle lay disassembled before her, every piece aligned with surgical precision. The smell of solvent and gun oil filled the air. Her hands moved slowly, cleaning each part with an old rag, tracing the edges with care. The rhythmic clink of metal was the only sound. It wasn't just maintenance, it was meditation. She had done this ritual after every mission that mattered, not because the rifle needed it, but because she did. Each swipe of the cloth was a way to breathe again, to come down from the edge. The scrape of boots behind her broke the silence. She didn't look up. She already knew who it was. "Coffee," General Thorne said quietly. Two heavy ceramic mugs appeared on the table beside her. Steam curled upward, catching the light. He stood there for a moment, just watching her work. No rank between them now, only understanding. "They retired that call sign years ago," he said finally. His voice was softer than it had been all day. "Spectre said there was no need for ghosts anymore." Vance didn't stop cleaning the rifle. She blew a thin line of dust from the bolt and set it gently beside the receiver. "The world keeps finding uses for them, sir," she said. Thorne nodded, sipping his coffee. "My intel people have been digging through what's left of your file. Most of it's blacked out. Probably for the best. The parts that aren't, read like fiction." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "The paperwork's usually more pleasant than the truth, General." He chuckled, a dry, tired sound. "I can imagine." Silence stretched again, not awkward, just heavy with everything that didn't need saying. After a while he spoke again. "Rivas came to see me." She paused, the brush frozen mid-stroke. "Tried to hand in his resignation," Thorne continued. "Said he wasn't fit to lead men after today." Vance resumed her task, voice steady. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the first sign of a good leader is realizing when you've been a fool. The second is learning from it. I told him he's going to learn from you." That earned another faint smile. She reassembled the rifle piece by piece, the sounds precise, metal sliding into place, the click of pins locking, the whisper of the charging handle drawn back and released. By the time she seated the final component, the weapon looked whole again, clean, lethal, perfect. Thorne watched, quietly impressed. "They're calling you the Ghost of Kestrel." Vance racked the bolt one last time, the sharp clack echoing through the bay. She set the weapon down gently, safe on the table. "Ghosts don't need names, sir." "Maybe not," he said, "but they deserve respect." For the first time, she met his eyes fully. The exhaustion there wasn't just physical. It was the kind that comes from carrying too many stories no one's allowed to tell. She reached for the coffee mug he'd brought and wrapped both scarred hands around it. The warmth bled into her palms, soft against the tight, uneven skin. Outside, the night stretched wide and black. The mountains loomed, cold sentinels keeping watch. "Some things don't retire, sir," she said quietly. "They just get filed away until someone remembers why they mattered." Thorne nodded. "Then I'm glad the world remembered today." They stood side by side in silence, sipping coffee, staring into the darkness beyond the open bay doors. No medals, no ceremony, just two soldiers who understood what the other had lost. After a while, Vance set the mug down and looked back at her rifle, the clean lines glinting under the fluorescent light. Duty had called her out of the past one more time, and she'd answered. She always would, until the silence claimed her again. The general turned to leave, stopping at the door. "For what it's worth," he said over his shoulder, "when my report goes up the chain, it won't be about ghosts. It'll be about the kind of courage that doesn't need a name." She didn't respond, she didn't have to. He walked out into the night, and the echo of his boots faded into the hum of generators. Alone again, Vance looked out at the dark mountains, the same ones that had witnessed her return. Somewhere out there lay the battlefield, cooling under moonlight, silent now. She exhaled slowly. A small cloud of breath drifted upward and vanished. Maybe ghosts don't haunt battlefields. Maybe they guard them. She reached for her rifle, checked the chamber, and engaged the safety. The soft click was final, like closing a book. Outside, a lone gust swept through the open bay door, stirring the dust on the floor, the same dust that clung to every soul who'd ever walked this far from home. And in that quiet, the moral of it all lingered unspoken, yet undeniable. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What does a ghost remember when the world stops needing her? Sleep didn't come easily that night. In the dim light of the maintenance bay, Sergeant Major Ella Vance sat against the wall beside her cot, boots still on, rifle leaning within reach. Outside, the night wind dragged through the valley, rattling canvas and whispering against steel. The base was quiet now, too quiet. That kind of stillness only came after chaos, when adrenaline drained and ghosts crept back in. She closed her eyes, but rest never followed. It hadn't in years. Every time she tried, she saw fire. She heard screams. And then the same sound, the dull, echoing thump that had ended one life and remade another. The sound that had given her the scars. Years ago, before the silver in her hair, before she'd been buried under logistics files and administrative commendations, she had been someone else. Spectre. The name had weight once. It belonged to an era that officially never happened, Black Ops missions in countries that didn't exist on the map, places where war hid behind politics and denial. Back then she'd been younger, faster, hungrier. The military's secret answer to problems too delicate for headlines. She remembered the first time she'd earned that name. Bosnia, winter, a small town cut off by insurgents, 2 hostages, one narrow window before they vanished into the hills. Her spotter had asked, "You got them?" She replied, "I don't miss." And she hadn't. From 800 meters out, through snow and smoke, she'd ended it before it began. The hostage takers fell, the captives walked free, and her co had said one word over the radio, Spectre. After that, she was the one they called when the map stopped helping. She remembered the quiet nights more than the firefights. Waiting for hours in frozen mud, breath fogging her scope, pulse slow and measured. War had taught her patience, and patience had turned her into something unrecognizable. But every legend has an expiration date. The mission that ended her came years later, Chechnya, unofficial, unsanctioned. Her orders were to extract an informant from deep insurgent territory. Simple on paper, nothing ever is. She could still feel the cold of that mountain bunker, the stink of oil and blood and fear. She made it to the informant, a terrified young medic who knew too much about chemical stockpiles and Russian contracts. They'd almost made it out. Almost. The explosion was sudden, a grenade thrown blind down a hallway. Instinct took over. She shielded the informant with her body. Then nothing. When she woke up 3 days later, it was to the smell of antiseptic and the dull ache of burned flesh. Her hands wrapped in gauze, her face half numb, half fire. The doctor didn't have to say much. The mirror said it for him. She'd been beautiful once, maybe. That was gone now. The price of survival is always something you can't replace. The burns healed, the scars didn't. Neither did the mind. She'd been marked non-deployable. Reassign her, the report said. She's done her duty. So they did. They buried her under files and titles: Sergeant Major Vance, administrative lead, logistics overseer, efficiency expert. The ghost was gone. At least that's what everyone believed. The sound of footsteps snapped her back to the present. It was late past 200, but someone was approaching. The shadow that appeared in the doorway was tentative, hesitant. Permission to enter, ma'am. She didn't need to look to recognize the voice. Riva's. He stepped into the bay, the dim light painting tired lines across his face. He looked younger tonight, stripped of arrogance. His hands fidgeted with the brim of his cap, unsure of where to put his guilt. You're awake, he said softly. I usually am. Silence stretched between them, the kind of silence where both people already knew the truth, but neither knew how to speak it. Rivas finally exhaled. I read the after-action report, he said. They said you saved us. She didn't look up. I did my job. That's not what I meant. He hesitated again, then forced himself to continue. When you walked into that briefing, I thought you were. Administrative, she finished for him. Yeah. She set down the cleaning rag and turned toward him. Her eyes were sharp but calm. You weren't wrong, that's what they made me, but it's not what I was. He swallowed hard, throat tight. The way you handled that rifle, I've never seen. It's not about the rifle, she interrupted softly. It's about what it costs to use it right. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the mountains beyond the open bay door. People think courage is loud, she said, that it shouts orders, kicks doors, breaks things, but sometimes it's just the choice to keep going when you have nothing left to prove. Rivas stood there, his pride stripped bare. I was wrong about you, he said finally, about everything. I know. There was no anger in her tone, no victory either, just truth. She stood, stepped closer, and stopped an arm's length away. The fluorescent light caught the scars along her cheek, turning them silver again. Tell me something, Staff Sergeant, she said quietly. When you looked at me before, when you saw these scars, what did you think they meant? Rivas hesitated. That you'd been broken. She nodded slowly. You weren't wrong about that either. Then she tilted her head slightly. The difference is, I learned how to live broken and still keep fighting. The words hung there, heavy, simple, undeniable. Rivas's eyes dropped. If you ever need my team again. She shook her head. I don't need your loyalty. I just need you to remember what humility looks like when the next quiet soldier walks through your gate. He nodded, shame and respect braided tight in his expression. Yes, ma'am. When he turned to leave, she called after him. Rivas. He looked back. Make sure Miller gets checked again by the medics in the morning. Tourniquet might have been too tight. He blinked, a flash of surprise. You noticed that? I notice everything, she said. It's how I stay alive. For the first time he smiled, a small one, honest. Understood. He walked out into the cold, the door swinging shut behind him. The night swallowed his footsteps. Vance sat back down, her eyes following the line of stars outside. They always looked different out here, closer, sharper, almost within reach. It reminded her of the nights she used to watch them from foreign rooftops, her scope aimed just below the same constellations. Once she'd believed that surviving meant returning home in one piece. But the older she got, the more she realized coming home doesn't always mean healing. Sometimes it means learning how to live with the parts that never stopped fighting. Her hands flexed unconsciously, the old burns tightening with emotion. She remembered what the medics had said after the blast. "You're lucky to be alive." She nodded back then, but she'd never really believed it. Tonight, though, watching those stars, feeling the ache in her hands and the calm in her chest, she almost did. By dawn, the base was stirring again. Helicopters hummed, radios crackled, the smell of burnt coffee filled the air. She walked the perimeter as the sun rose, quiet, deliberate, unnoticed. That was how she preferred it. Every Marine she passed straightened instinctively. Some saluted, others nodded awkwardly, unsure what to say to a legend walking among them. She returned every gesture with the same calm professionalism. No pride, no distance, just presence. When she reached the edge of the outpost, she stopped and looked out over the valley. The battlefield below was invisible now, swallowed by daylight, but she could still see it in her mind. The smoke, the dust, the tiny flashes of muzzle fire. And the stillness afterward. She thought of Miller, young, reckless, eager to prove himself. She thought of Rivas, proud, loud, capable, but blind to humility. And she thought of Chun, the quiet one, the only one who had seen her clearly from the start. Maybe that was the point. Every generation of soldiers has to learn the same lesson again. Respect doesn't come from rank. It comes from what you carry when no one's watching. She turned and started back toward the base. Her boots left shallow prints in the dust, soon to be erased by the wind. That was fine. Ghosts don't need footprints, they just need purpose. Inside the command tent, General Thorne was waiting. He was studying a wall of reports, but his mind was elsewhere. When she entered, he looked up and gave a faint smile. "Morning, Sergeant Major," he said. "Sir?" "Heading out." "Heading home." He nodded, though he looked reluctant. "You sure you don't want to stay? We could use someone like you." She studied him for a long moment. "You already have what you need, General. You just have to start listening to it, even when it doesn't sound like you expect." He smiled again, quietly this time. Understood. He reached out, offering his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, respectful, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as a soldier to another soldier. When she stepped outside, the light was brighter than she expected. The wind kicked up another small storm of dust across the runway, just as it had the day she arrived. Only this time, no one was laughing. The same Marines who'd once mocked her stood watching as she walked toward the waiting transport truck. Their faces were solemn, their eyes following her until she disappeared inside. No applause, no ceremony. Just quiet understanding, the kind that lasts longer than medals ever will. The engine started. The truck rolled forward, heading down the narrow road that wound out of the base. In the mirror, the outpost shrank, just another dot in a desert that forgot everything eventually. Vance leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes, and let the hum of the engine blur the edges of thought. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She just felt like a soldier who'd done what needed doing. Maybe that's all any of them ever were. Not heroes, not legends. Just people who refused to stop showing up, even when no one believed they still could. What happens after the mission ends, but the war does? The road from forward operating base Kestrel wound through an endless desert, a ribbon of cracked asphalt vanishing into the horizon. The transport truck hummed steadily, its engine the only heartbeat for miles. Sergeant Major Ella Vance sat in the passenger seat, silent, her gaze fixed on the mountains receding behind them. The peaks were sharp silhouettes against the morning sky, cold, distant, and still watching. The driver, a young private, kept his eyes on the road. He stole glances at her now and then, curiosity flickering behind his nervousness. He'd heard the stories already, everyone on the base had. The ghost of Kestrel, the woman who'd walked into hell alone and walked out carrying half a platoon's survival. But in person, she didn't look like a legend. She looked tired, human, real. They rode in silence for a long time before he finally spoke. "Ma'am, is it true what they're saying?" Vance didn't look away from the window. "What are they saying?" "That you used to be something else, before personnel, before logistics." She didn't answer right away. The desert rolled by outside, flat, endless, shimmering with heat even in the morning light. "Everything used to be something else," she said quietly. The private nodded, unsure what to make of that. He didn't ask again. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the world to bone and gold. The heat shimmered on the horizon like mirage smoke. Vance reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, battered photo, folded, creased, almost colorless. It showed a group of soldiers standing beside a Humvee, grinning at the camera, eyes squinting against the sun. They were young, too young. And there she was among them, unscarred, her smile faint but real. She stared at that face for a long time, the woman she used to be. Back when war still felt like a cause instead of a sentence. Her thumb traced over the image, stopping on a familiar face, Wren, her old spotter. He died 12 years ago in a raid that went sideways. She'd been the one who carried him back, the one who had to report that his last words were, "Did we finish the job?" She folded the photo again, tucking it back into her pocket like something fragile. That's the thing about ghosts, they don't haunt places, they haunt people. By late afternoon, the truck rolled into a small forward resupply point, a skeleton outpost of fuel tanks, supply crates, and half a dozen tents. The kind of place that looked temporary even after 10 years. Vance stepped down from the cab, stretching the stiffness from her legs. Her boots hit the dirt with the same soft authority as always, quiet, but final. The private saluted awkwardly. "Ma'am, I think this is where I—" "Refuel," she said. "Then head back before dark. Roads aren't friendly at night." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, then added, "It was an honor, Sergeant Major." She gave him a small nod. "Take care of yourself, soldier." He climbed back into the cab, engine rumbling to life again. The truck rolled away, leaving her standing in a cloud of dust that settled slowly over her boots. And then she was alone. She arranged her own way out, a small military transport chopper heading toward a coalition logistics hub 200 kilometers west. It wasn't much, but it would get her closer to home. While waiting, she sat on a crate beside the airstrip, the desert stretching endless before her. The wind played through her hair. Somewhere far off, she heard distant gunfire, the kind that never really stopped in this part of the world. She thought about General Thorne, about the salute, the coffee, the quiet respect in his voice. It had felt strange. After years of being dismissed, ignored, or forgotten, she hadn't known what to do with reverence. Respect is heavier than shame. You can't hide from it. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small notepad, a field journal, edges frayed, the cover faded. She flipped through the pages, coordinates, sketches of terrain, half-written notes on tactics. Then, near the back, she found an entry dated 3 years ago. It read, "I keep thinking about the silence that follows a mission. It's louder than the gunfire." She stared at the words for a long moment, then closed the notebook and slipped it back into her pack. The silence now felt exactly like that, vast, echoing, uncomfortably alive. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, cutting through the haze. Its rotors stirred up a storm of dust as it landed. The crew chief leaned out, shouting over the noise. "Sergeant Major Vance." She grabbed her bag and rifle, stepped forward and nodded. "That's me." "Hop in, we're heading west." She climbed aboard. The cabin was empty except for 2 crewmen and a stack of supply crates. As the bird lifted off, the desert shrank beneath her, endless waves of gold and shadow rolling toward infinity. The farther they flew, the more she felt the weight of quiet pressing against her. For most soldiers, leaving the battlefield meant safety. For her, it only meant remembering. She rested her head back, closed her eyes, and let the steady thump of the rotors pull her somewhere else. The memory came uninvited. A hallway lit by fire, the taste of blood and smoke, the sharp pain of shrapnel biting deep, and a voice faint, trembling, "You shouldn't have come back for me." Her own voice replying, hoarse and certain, "I always come back." Then the explosion. The light. The sound of her own body hitting the floor. She jolted awake, breath shallow, heart pounding. The crewman across from her noticed, "You okay, ma'am?" "Yeah," she wiped a hand across her face. "Just turbulence." But there was no turbulence. Just ghosts. They landed near dusk at the logistics hub, a sprawl of metal containers and floodlights in the middle of nowhere. She thanked the pilot, stepped out, and slung her bag over her shoulder. A young officer greeted her near the flight line, clipboard in hand. "Sergeant Major Vance, we've been told to get you accommodations for the night. Transport to Bagram leaves at 600. "That'll do," she said. "Ma'am," he hesitated. "Is it true you're the one from the Kestrel operation?" She didn't answer, she just walked past him. Her quarters were nothing more than a metal box with a cot, a fan, and a single bulb. She sat on the edge of the bed, the walls humming with distant generators. It felt too clean, too quiet. Her hands fidgeted, not from nerves, but habit. The urge to move, to check, to do something. The body takes longer to stand down than the mission. After a while, she stood and walked to the small sink, splashing water on her face. The reflection in the mirror stopped her cold. The scars were still there, pale ribbons of memory carved across her skin. She stared at them in the flickering light, not with self-pity, not anymore. They weren't reminders of pain. They were proof. Proof she'd lived through things meant to end her. Proof that survival has its own kind of beauty, not the kind people write songs about, but the kind that whispers, "I'm still here." A soft knock came at the door. She tensed automatically. Old instincts never die, then relaxed. When she opened it, Sergeant Chun stood there, hands behind his back. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Always." He hesitated, then said, "Reva's asked me to give you this." He handed her a folded scrap of paper. She took it carefully, unfolding it. It wasn't a formal letter, just a few handwritten words. "I thought leadership meant never being afraid. You taught me it means never pretending you aren't. Are." She read it twice, then folded it once neatly and tucked it into the same pocket as the old photograph. 2 pieces of her life, one from before, one from now, pressed together like bookends. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. Chun nodded. "It was an honor, ma'am." Before he turned to go, he added softly, "They're still talking about you back there." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh." "Yeah, some of the guys started calling that Ridge Specter's watch." For the first time in a long while, she smiled, small, genuine. "That's a terrible name." "Maybe," Chun said, "but they say it with respect." He saluted her, crisp, sharp, proud. She returned it, no words, no need. When he left, she sat down again on the edge of the cot, the letter still warm in her pocket. Outside, the desert wind howled across the compound, carrying the faint clang of metal, the whisper of shifting sand. She leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, listening. This was the part no one ever filmed, the part after victory, after survival. The long, slow silence where soldiers are left alone with the echoes. But for the first time, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. She thought of Rivas and his men, of Thorne and the salute, of the laughter that had turned to reverence, of the ghosts she'd carried and the lives she'd saved. Maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not a medal or a ceremony, but the quiet certainty that somewhere, someone learned to be better because you existed. She reached for the mug of water beside the cot, took a slow sip, and whispered to no one in particular, "That's enough." Outside, the wind continued its endless patrol, sweeping across the desert, the same wind that had carried the sound of gunfire days ago, now carrying only peace. And in that moment, Ella Vance, the ghost, the sniper, the survivor, allowed herself to rest. Not because the world was safe, but because, for once, she'd done enough to make a small corner of it so. What does peace feel like when you've spent your life surviving war? The plane touched down just after sunrise. The windows glowed with soft light, the kind that made everything look cleaner than it was. From the aisle seat, Sergeant Major Ella Vance watched the tarmac blur past, a smear of color and movement. Home. That's what they called it. But for soldiers like her, the word didn't mean the same thing anymore. Home wasn't a place. It was the quiet between missions, the breath between losses, the moment before the next call came in. When the plane stopped, passengers stood, pulling down bags, chatting softly. She sat still, letting them go first. Old habits die quietly, never be the first to move, never block an exit, always watch before you act. When she finally stepped out, the air hit her, heavy with humidity, thick with city life. Car horns, voices, the low hum of civilization. After months of sand and silence, it felt almost unreal. She slung her duffel over one shoulder, adjusted the strap, and walked toward the terminal. No one was waiting for her. There never was. Her family had learned long ago that she came home in fragments. They'd stopped meeting flights years ago, stopped asking when she'd retire for good. She moved through the crowd unnoticed, another uniform among travelers, her ribbons subdued, her name tag plain. The scars on her face drew a few glances, the kind people give out of reflex before looking away in embarrassment. She didn't mind. Pity was easier to live with than curiosity. Outside, the city unfolded, noisy, alive, indifferent. She hailed a cab, gave an address without thinking. Muscle memory, not intention. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, looked at her in the mirror. "You military?" "Yes." "Coming home or going back?" She paused, still figuring that out. He smiled faintly. "You folks always say that." The cab dropped her off at a small apartment complex on the edge of town. Third floor, end unit, same place she'd kept for years but never really lived in. She unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, untouched. The walls were bare except for one framed photo, a younger version of herself in uniform, standing beside a small group of soldiers, their smiles broad and alive. She didn't look at it for long. Setting her duffel down, she sat on the couch. The springs groaned under her weight. The silence felt too loud. She'd imagined this moment before, the day she'd finally come home for good. But imagination never included the emptiness that followed. For a long time she just sat there, hands still, eyes unfocused, until her body reminded her that it existed. The stiffness, the aches, the faint ringing in her ear that never quite went away. The invisible metals that no one saw, pain, insomnia, survivor's guilt. She reached for the remote, turned on the TV not to watch, but to fill the room with sound. Some daytime talk show droned in the background. The laughter felt like a language she no longer spoke. Days passed. One blurred into the next. She went through the motions. Grocery store, laundry, quiet walks through the park at dawn. Ordinary things, normal things. But normal felt foreign. When people passed her on the sidewalk, they smiled politely, unaware that the woman they brushed shoulders with had once neutralized an entire ambush alone. They didn't know that her calm wasn't peace. It was the stillness of someone who'd run out of adrenaline but hadn't learned how to rest. She spent hours cleaning her apartment the same way she used to clean her rifle piece by piece, with precision, like control could hold the chaos back. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wake from dreams that weren't quite nightmares but close. The whine of rotors, the pop of distant gunfire, the smell of burning diesel. She'd sit up, heart pounding, then remind herself, not there, not anymore. But her body didn't believe it. It never did. One afternoon, a knock came at the door, sharp, official. She opened it to find a delivery man holding a small brown package. "Ella Vance?" "Yes." "Signature, please." She signed the tablet. The man handed over the box and left without another word. She carried it to the table, cut the tape with a key. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a polished wooden plaque, a commendation from the Marine Corps engraved in gold lettering. For distinguished service and valor under fire during Operation Serpent's Tooth. Presented to Sergeant Major Ella Vance. There was no medal, just words. She stared at them for a while, tracing the engraving with a thumb. Somewhere in the file room of a Pentagon basement, she'd gone from administrative logistics officer to heroic operative. Funny how paperwork worked when guilt needed to look like gratitude. She set the plaque aside. It didn't feel like hers. The next morning, she went to the VA clinic downtown. Not for herself at first, at least that's what she told herself. She said she was there to update her records, confirm benefits, but the truth was simpler. She wanted to remember what human voices sounded like when they weren't shouting commands. The waiting room was crowded, veterans of every age, every story. Some wore prosthetics, some wore smiles that didn't reach their eyes. All of them carried something heavy. She sat quietly watching. It struck her how similar they all looked, not in appearance but in stillness. That same unspoken fatigue. That same way of sitting like you're ready to move at any second. When her name was called, she met with a counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Halbrook. "Sergeant Major Vance," she said, shaking her hand. "It's an honor. I've read about your work." Vance gave a polite nod. Paperwork always makes things sound neater than they were. Halbrook smiled gently. "How are you sleeping?" "Fine." "Any nightmares?" "None that stay." The doctor studied her face, then her hands, the scars, the small tremors that came and went. "You've been through a lot," she said softly. "So has everyone in that waiting room. That doesn't make your burden lighter." "I don't need it to be." Halbrook didn't press. She just said, "You don't have to be Spectre here, Sergeant Major. You can just be Ella." The words landed harder than expected. Just Ella. It had been years since anyone said her name like that, stripped of rank, history, legend. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. When she finally did, her voice came quiet, almost fragile. "I don't know who that is anymore." The counselor nodded. "Then maybe that's who you're here to find." That night, Vance stood by her apartment window, looking out over the city lights. She could hear laughter from a nearby street, people spilling out of a restaurant, alive, loud, unafraid. For a moment, she envied them. The simplicity of their world, the innocence of believing that danger always happened somewhere else. But then she smiled faintly, almost invisible. That was the point, wasn't it? She'd spent her life making sure people like them could live in that illusion. It was the quiet victory no one clapped for. She reached for her coffee mug, the same one she'd used back at Kestrel. A chip ran along the rim, catching the light. She held it the way she'd held it then, feeling the warmth seep into her scarred hands. And for a moment, she could almost hear the hum of the generators again, smell the gun oil, feel the weight of the rifle beside her. The battlefield never really left, it just changed shape. A week later, she visited a small military cemetery outside the city. The rows of headstones stretched in perfect lines, white against green. She carried a single flower, simple, unassuming like her. She stopped at one of the graves, kneeling carefully. Sergeant James Wren, her old spotter. She placed the flower down, brushed dust from the name. "They said we'd never get old," she murmured. "Guess one of us kept that promise." A small laugh escaped, tired but real. Then softly, "You were right, about finishing the job." The wind carried her words away, scattering them among the trees. She stood, gave a small, silent salute, and turned to leave. Back home that night, she finally hung the plaque on her wall, not for herself, but for them, for the names that would never make it to the engraving. She stood there for a long time, staring at it. It gleamed under the lamplight, too polished, too clean, like it belonged to someone else. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was what legacy really was, something that lived outside of you, passed along quietly, without permission. She turned off the light, the room fading into shadow. Only the plaque caught a sliver of moonlight, glowing faintly in the dark. As she sat back on the couch, the city murmuring outside, she finally exhaled. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for the next fight. She was Spectre. She wasn't the scarred woman they'd mocked or the ghost they'd honored. She was just Ella Vance, survivor, teacher, quiet protector. And maybe that was enough. She closed her eyes and listened, not to silence, but to the gentle rhythm of life returning, one breath at a time. The war inside her wasn't over. But for once, it was quiet. How do you retire from something that still breathes inside you? The city was waking. Steam rose from manholes. A street vendor rolled his cart past the sidewalk cafe where Ella Vance sat with her coffee, watching traffic blur by. She wore plain clothes now, jeans, jacket, hair tied back. No uniform, no insignia. But even without it, people could tell. There was something in her posture, a precision, a stillness that didn't belong to civilians. A soft voice broke her focus. "Ella." She turned. It was Dr. Halbrook, her counselor from the VA. The woman smiled warmly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all." They sat together, silence comfortable between them. "You've been keeping busy," Halbrook said after a while. "Trying to," Vance replied. "Volunteering at the range, training some of the younger recruits, helps with the noise." Halbrook nodded. "You've always needed a mission." "Doesn't everyone?" The doctor smiled faintly. "Some people just call theirs living." Vance's gaze drifted toward the horizon, the rising sun washing the skyline in gold. "Yeah," she said softly, "still learning that part." She started visiting the Marine training facility twice a week, not officially, not under contract, just to help. At first, the new recruits didn't know who she was. They assumed she was some retired officer offering tips. But the way she handled a rifle, the quiet authority in her voice, it gave her away quickly. "Is it true, ma'am," one had asked during a break, "that you were Spectre?" She just looked at him, calm and unblinking. "Names don't matter, accuracy does." They laughed nervously, unsure whether it was a joke. It was. Over time, respect replaced curiosity. They started calling her ma'am without hesitation, listening when she spoke, learning not just how to shoot but how to think. She taught them patience, observation, the kind of awareness that keeps you alive when adrenaline wants to kill you. And maybe in some small way she taught them something else too, that strength isn't volume and courage isn't noise. One afternoon, while she was adjusting a trainee's stance at the range, a shadow fell across the firing line. A man in uniform stood at the edge, high-ranking, clean-cut, his presence commanding even from a distance. General Thorne. Vance straightened slowly, her brows lifting in quiet surprise. General. Sergeant Major, he smiled faintly. You still correct everyone who calls you retired. Only when they're wrong. He chuckled. Good to see you, Vance. You too, sir. What brings you here? His tone shifted. I'd like to walk. They walked side by side along the edge of the training field. The wind carried the faint crack of gunfire from the range behind them. Thorne's voice was low, deliberate. We've been reviewing classified archives from the old Serpent's Tooth operation. Some loose ends came up. Loose ends, she repeated. One of your informants from that mission, the medic you saved, resurfaced. He's under protection in Eastern Europe. Someone's trying to find him again. Vance's step slowed. Who? We're not sure, but his intel connects to ongoing weapons trafficking, and there's something else. He handed her a tablet, encrypted briefings, photos, reports. When she saw the first image, her stomach tightened. A familiar insignia, black serpent coiled around a dagger. Vori, she murmured. Exactly. The same mercenary network that had nearly killed her years ago. She looked up at Thorne. You're telling me they're back. I'm telling you they never left. He watched her face carefully. We could use your insight, not on the ground, advisory only. You'd be working remote, helping analysts connect the old data. Why me? Because you know their patterns better than anyone alive. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze went distant, somewhere between memory and instinct. Finally, she said, I thought I was done, General. So did I, he admitted. But some wars wait for you to get comfortable before reminding you they're not over. The words lingered. She handed the tablet back. Give me a day. That night she couldn't sleep. The hum of city life outside her window felt too loud, too foreign. She sat on the edge of her bed, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor. On the dresser beside her lay two things, her commendation plaque and her old field journal. She opened the journal again, flipping through until she found a page near the end. The handwriting was smaller here, more rushed. Sometimes survival feels like punishment, but maybe it's purpose disguised as pain. She closed the book, ran a thumb over the scar along her jaw, and exhaled slowly. Maybe this was purpose again. Not the kind that carried rifles, but the kind that carried memory. The next morning, she walked into Thorne's office without waiting for an escort. All right, she said, you have me, advisory only. Thorne smiled, knew you'd come around. Don't flatter yourself, she said. I came because I hate unfinished work. The weeks that followed were slow, methodical. She worked in a quiet analysis room deep inside a federal facility. Dim lights, hum of servers, endless streams of data. Most people there were analysts in clean shirts, hands unscarred, eyes bright with theory. She didn't fit in, but she didn't need to. Her mind moved differently, not through numbers but patterns, behavior, instinct. Look here, she told one of the agents, pointing to a series of transactions. See the timing, the routing through dead accounts. That's how they smuggle logistics, not through cargo but donations. The agent blinked. How do you see that so fast? She shrugged. Because I used to hunt ghosts. You start to notice when someone else moves like one. Days turned into weeks. One night she was the last one in the room. The servers hummed softly, the monitors casting blue light across her face. On the screen, an encrypted communication flashed, recently intercepted. A list of coordinates, supply transfers, code names. One caught her eye. Project Echo, retrieval of Asset V. Her heart paused for half a beat. She opened the file. It wasn't just a code. It was a reference V, short for Vance. Her own name. Someone was still tracking her. someone who knew she'd survived. She stood slowly, the room spinning slightly from adrenaline. Her instincts, the old ones, flared awake. Years of quiet were gone in an instant, the calm replaced by alertness, readiness, control. She picked up the phone, called Thorne directly. "General, we have a problem." Within an hour, he was there, jacket thrown over his shoulders, eyes sharp. "What did you find?" She turned the monitor toward him. "They're not just rebuilding the network, they're hunting me." Thorne frowned. "How?" "Because I was their mistake, the one who lived." For the first time in years, she felt the old clarity return, cold, clean, precise. She wasn't afraid, she was awake. Thorne's voice lowered. "You think they'll come here?" "No," she said. "They're smarter than that. They'll wait until I move, until I think I'm safe." He studied her. "What do you want to do?" She looked down at her hands, steady, scarred, certain. "I want to end it, completely this time." That night she walked home through the city streets. Rain had begun to fall, thin, silver lines under streetlights. Her reflection followed her in every puddle, fractured and blurred. At an intersection she paused, watching cars streak past. She thought about all the lives she'd lived, the sniper, the survivor, the ghost, the mentor. Maybe this was the last one, the closure she'd never had. Not revenge, just resolution. When she reached her apartment, she opened the drawer under her desk. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was a pistol. She hadn't touched it in months. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. The metal was cold, familiar. She checked the chamber, loaded it, and set it down again. Just seeing it was enough to steady her breathing. She didn't plan to use it, not yet. But knowing she could meant control. The next day, she met with Thorne again. "They'll expect me to run," she said, "so I won't, I'll draw them out." He frowned. "You're not on active duty, Ella." "I wasn't on active duty the last time either. That didn't stop me from finishing the job." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You never change." "Neither do they," she said. "That's why they'll lose." For the next week, she prepared quietly, checking security cameras, mapping her routines, watching for tails. She saw nothing at first. Then one night she noticed it, a black sedan parked across from her building. No plates, same one 3 nights in a row. She didn't confront it, not yet. She waited. Patience, her oldest weapon. She learned long ago that the enemy always shows their hand eventually. You just have to be still enough to see it. By the 5th night, the car was gone. In its place, an envelope slid under her door. No return address, no markings. Inside, a single photograph. Her, walking out of Thorne's office 2 days ago. And beneath it, a line typed in red. "You should have stayed buried, Spectre." She stared at it for a long moment, the words burning themselves into her memory. Then she folded the photo, slipped it into her jacket, and whispered under her breath, "Maybe I should have, but I didn't." The quiet steel in her voice wasn't anger, it was inevitability. The war had come back. And Ella Vance, scarred, silent, and unbreakable, was ready to face it one last time. How do you fight an enemy you can't see anymore, when the real battle is inside you? The night was quiet. Too quiet. Ella Vance sat in the darkened apartment, a single lamp off, her reflection faint in the window. Rain traced slow paths down the glass, blurring the city lights below into halos. The photograph lay on the table in front of her, the one that had been slid under her door. She studied it again, her image grainy, distant, walking out of General Thorne's office. The red words beneath it, "You should have stayed buried, Spectre." She had read those words 20 times already. Each time, they hit the same way, not as a threat, but as a reminder. They thought she'd stopped being dangerous. They were wrong. She reached for the pistol she'd cleaned earlier, checked the chamber again, set it down with deliberate calm. Her heartbeat didn't rise. Her breathing didn't change. Fear wasn't part of her vocabulary anymore, only focus. She called Thorne. He answered on the first ring. "Talk to me," he said. "They've made contact," she replied. "Direct. Photograph, threat, surveillance." He exhaled sharply. "We'll put a team on you." "No." Her tone was even, decisive. "They want me isolated. If I look protected, they'll vanish again. Ella, this isn't your job anymore." "I know, but it's still my mess." There was silence on the line, then Thorne's voice softened. "What's your plan?" And this quietly. "Vance." "Sir," she interrupted, "you of all people know sometimes the right move doesn't come with permission." He didn't argue after that. He just said, "Be careful, Spectre." She almost smiled. "Always am." By dawn she was gone. The apartment looked untouched, except for the folded note she left on the table, short, handwritten, deliberate. "If I don't come back, make sure they stop looking. It's over either way." EV. The trail led her north, to an abandoned shipping warehouse near the coast. Old contacts had whispered about it. A ghost hub, they called it. A front for off-grid operations linked to the same insignia she'd seen on the files. When she arrived, the air was heavy with salt and rust. The ocean crashed somewhere beyond the fog. She parked her bike a block away, adjusted the strap of her bag, and moved silently through the rain. Her clothes were plain, dark, her hair tucked under a cap. No rank, no name, just purpose. Inside, the warehouse was vast and hollow. The echo of her footsteps vanished into metal. But she wasn't alone. A voice drifted out from the shadows. "You came after all." She recognized it instantly. Rurik Vori. Once a name whispered in intelligence circles, now a ghost like her, only he'd chosen to haunt the world differently. A mercenary leader, ruthless, efficient, the man whose grenade had nearly ended her life 12 years ago. He stepped out of the dark, older but still broad-shouldered, eyes like cold glass. "I wondered if you'd take the bait," he said. "You never could resist cleaning up unfinished business." Her jaw tightened. "You sent men to find me." "I sent men to confirm a rumor. The famous Spectre still breathing. Imagine my surprise." She said nothing. Her silence drew him closer. "You should have stayed in the shadows," he continued. "Now I have to finish what I started." Vance's eyes stayed fixed on him. "You already did once," she said softly. "All that's left now is memory." He smirked, still dramatic. "Still standing," she countered. The air between them crackled. Years of unfinished war compressed into a few feet of space. He reached for his weapon. She didn't flinch. "Don't," she said quietly. "You won't walk out if you do." He laughed low, dismissive. "You think you scare me." "No," she said. "I think you remember me." For a moment, something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe even unease. The kind a predator feels when it realizes the prey didn't die after all. He raised his pistol anyway. The echo of the click was swallowed by the sound of the tide. The next few seconds happened in silence. No shouting, no chaos, just instinct. A movement, a flash. 2 shots. When the echoes died, only one figure remained standing. Vance lowered her weapon, breathing steady. The other gun clattered to the floor. Rurik fell to his knees, eyes wide in disbelief. "You," he gasped, "you don't even hesitate." She knelt down, voice low and calm. "You think it takes courage to pull a trigger. It takes courage to live with it." He stared at her, realization dawning too late. Then his body went still. The rain poured harder now, drumming against the corrugated roof. Vance stood slowly, exhaling through the silence. No satisfaction, no triumph, just release. The ghost she'd been chasing all these years was gone, not the man, but the shadow he cast over her. She walked toward the open doors of the warehouse, the ocean air rushing in cold and sharp. Her body trembled slightly, not from fear, from the weight lifting. For the first time in years, her hands didn't shake. Her breathing was easy. She'd finished it, completely this time. By the time the authorities arrived, guided quietly by Thorne's order, she was gone again. They found the scene clean. 2 shell casings, no fingerprints. Only a single note, pinned to the wall with a knife. For every war that doesn't end when the shooting stops, let this one rest. EV. 2 weeks later, a quiet ceremony was held at Bagram Command Center. No press, no medals, just soldiers. General Thorne stood before a small gathering, Rivas, Chun, a handful of Marines who'd served at Kestrel. They were all there for the same reason, to honor someone who didn't ask for it. When Thorne spoke, his voice was steady. She never wanted recognition. She just wanted the truth to mean something, and it did because of her. He paused, glancing at the folded flag on the table beside him. She taught us that scars aren't signs of weakness. They're reminders of survival, of what we carry for others. He looked up, eyes wet but clear, and for that she'll always be saluted first. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. The room followed, a sea of silent respect. Outside, the wind carried the sound faint, solemn, almost like her name whispered across the sky. But Ella Vance wasn't buried. She was very much alive. Far from the base, in a quiet coastal town, a woman with a faint limp and silvered scars rented a small cabin overlooking the ocean. She spent her mornings walking the cliffs, her afternoons mending fishing nets for the locals. They didn't know who she was, and she didn't tell them. Sometimes at dusk, she'd sit on the porch, watching the horizon fade into gold and violet. Seagulls cried overhead, waves broke in steady rhythm. She carried no phone, no uniform, no weapons. Just the scars and a peace she'd never thought she'd find. One evening, a child from the village wandered up the path to her cabin, a boy, no older than 8, clutching a wooden toy plane with a broken wing. "Miss," he asked shyly, "can you fix this?" Vance smiled. "Let's see." She took the small plane in her hands, examining it carefully, fingers gentle despite the old burns. Within minutes, she tied it back together with a strand of fishing line, steady and precise. The boy grinned. "Thanks." She nodded. "Fly it safe." As he ran off, she watched him disappear into the fading light, laughter echoing over the cliffs. For a moment she felt something warm bloom inside her chest, small, quiet but real. She whispered to the sea, almost to herself, "That's all I ever wanted, for them to fly safe." Later that night, as the stars came out, she opened her notebook one last time. A blank page waited. She wrote slowly, deliberately. Maybe survival was never the point. Maybe it was learning how to live after. The scars are what broke me. They're what rebuilt me. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. She closed the book, set it on the table, and leaned back in her chair, listening to the waves below. For the first time in her life, Ella Vance, the ghost, the warrior, the woman they once mocked, finally disappeared the right way. Not as a legend, not as a soldier, but as someone who'd made peace with being both. The wind moved softly through the open window, lifting the curtain, carrying her last words out to sea. Sometimes the greatest victory is walking away and meaning it.